Chapter 50, Part 5 of the History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 5, Chapter 50, Part 5. The people of Mecca were hardened in their unbelief by superstition and envy. The elders of the city, the uncles of the prophet, affected to despise the presumption of an orphan, the reformer of his country. The pious orations of Mohammed in the Kaaba were answered by the clamors of Abu Talib. Citizens and pilgrims, listen not to the tempter, hearken not to his impious novelties, stand fast in the worship of Al-Lata and Al-Uzza. Yet the son of Abdallah was ever dear to the aged chief, and he protected the fame and person of his nephew against the assaults of the Koreishites, who had long been jealous of the preeminence of the family of Hashem. Their malice was colored by the pretense of religion. In the age of Job, the crime of impiety was punished by the Arabian magistrate, and Mohammed was guilty of deserting and denying the national deities. But so loose was the policy of Mecca, that the leaders of the Koreish, instead of accusing a criminal, were compelled to employ the measures of persuasion or violence. They repeatedly addressed Abu Talib in the style of reproach and menace. Thy nephew reviles our religion. He accuses our wise forefathers of ignorance and folly. Silence him quickly, lest he kindle tumult and discord in the city. If he persevere, we shall draw our swords against him and his adherents, and thou wilt be responsible for the blood of thy fellow citizens. The weight and moderation of Abu Talib eluded the violence of religious faction. The most helpless or timid of the disciples retired to Ethiopia, and the prophet withdrew himself to various places of strength in the town and country. As he was still supported by his family, the rest of the tribe of Koreish engaged themselves to renounce all intercourse with the children of Hashim, neither to buy nor to sell, nor to marry nor to give in marriage, but to pursue them with implacable enmity, till they should deliver the person of Mohammed to the justice of the gods. The decree was suspended in the Kaaba before the eyes of the nation. The messengers of the Koreish pursued the Mussulman exiles in the heart of Africa. They besieged the prophet and his most faithful followers, intercepted their water, and inflamed their mutual animosity by the retaliation of injuries and insults. A doubtful truce restored the appearances of concord, till the death of Abu Talib abandoned Mohammed to the power of his enemies, at the moment when he was deprived of his domestic comforts by the loss of his faithful and generous Khadijah. Abu Sophian, the chief of the branch of Ommiyah, succeeded to the principality of the Republic of Mecca. A zealous votary of the idols, a mortal foe of the line of Hashem, he convened an assembly of the Koreishites and their allies to decide the fate of the apostle. His imprisonment might provoke the despair of his enthusiasm, and the exile of an eloquent and popular fanatic would diffuse the mischief throughout the provinces of Arabia. His death was resolved, and they agreed that a sword from each tribe should be buried in his heart, to divide the guilt of his blood, and baffle the vengeance of the Hashemites. An angel, or a spy, revealed their conspiracy, and flight was the only resource of Mohammed. At the dead of night, accompanied by his friend Abu Bekr, he silently escaped from his house. The assassins watched at the door, but they were deceived by the figure of Ali, who reposed on the bed, and was covered with the green vestment of the apostle. The Koreish respected the piety of the heroic youth, but some verses of Ali, which are still extant, exhibit an interesting picture of his anxiety, his tenderness, and his religious confidence. 3 days Mohammed and his companion were concealed in the cave of Thor, at the distance of a league from Mecca, and in the close of each evening they received from the son and daughter of Abu Bekr a secret supply of intelligence and food. The diligence of the Koreish explored every haunt in the neighborhood of the city. They arrived at the entrance of the cavern, but the providential deceit of a spider's web and a pigeon's nest is supposed to have convinced them that the place was solitary and inviolate. "We are only 2," said the trembling Abu Bekr. "There is a third," replied the prophet. "It is God himself." No sooner was the pursuit abated than the 2 fugitives issued from the rock and mounted their camels. On the road to Medina they were overtaken by the emissaries of the Koreish. They redeemed themselves with prayers and promises from their hands. In this eventful moment, the lance of an Arab might have changed the history of the world. The flight of the prophet from Mecca to Medina has fixed the memorable era of the Hegira, which, at the end of 12 centuries, still discriminates the lunar years of the Mohammedan nations. The religion of the Koran might have perished in its cradle, had not Medina embraced with faith and reverence the holy outcasts of Mecca. Medina, or the city, known under the name of Yathreb, before it was sanctified by the throne of the prophet, was divided between the tribes of the Karagites and the Awasites, whose hereditary feud was rekindled by the slightest provocations. 2 colonies of Jews, who boasted a sacerdotal race, were their humble allies, and without converting the Arabs, they introduced the taste of science and religion, which distinguished Medina as the city of the book. Some of her noblest citizens, in a pilgrimage to the Caaba, were converted by the preaching of Mohammed. On their return, they diffused the belief of God and his prophet, and the new alliance was ratified by their deputies in 2 secret and nocturnal interviews on a hill in the suburbs of Mecca. In the first, 10 Charagites and 2 Alsites, united in faith and love, protested in the name of their wives, their children, and their absent brethren, that they would forever profess the creed and observe the precepts of the Koran. The second was a political association, the first vital spark of the empire of the Saracens. 73 men and 2 women of Medina held a solemn conference with Mohammed, his kinsmen, and his disciples, and pledged themselves to each other by a mutual oath of fidelity. They promised, in the name of the city, that if he should be banished they would receive him as a confederate, obey him as a leader, and defend him to the last extremity, like their wives and children. "But if you are recalled by your country," they asked with a flattering anxiety, "will you not abandon your new allies?" "All things," replied Mohammed with a smile, "are now common between us. Your blood is as my blood, your ruin as my ruin. We are bound to each other by the ties of honor and interest. I am your friend, and the enemy of your foes." "But if we are killed in your service, what," exclaimed the deputies of Medina, "will be our reward?" "Paradise," replied the prophet. "Stretch forth thy hand." He stretched it forth, and they reiterated the oath of allegiance and fidelity. Their treaty was ratified by the people, who unanimously embraced the profession of Islam. They rejoiced in the exile of the apostle, but they trembled for his safety, and impatiently expected his arrival. After a perilous and rapid journey along the seacoast, he halted at Koba, 2 miles from the city, and made his public entry into Medina, 16 days after his flight from Mecca. 500 of the citizens advanced to meet him. He was hailed with acclamations of loyalty and devotion. Mohammed was mounted on a she-camel, an umbrella shaded his head, and a turban was unfurled before him to supply the deficiency of a standard. His bravest disciples, who had been scattered by the storm, assembled round his person, and the equal though various merits of the Moslems were distinguished by the name of Mohagarians and Ansars, the fugitives of Mecca and the auxiliaries of Medina. To eradicate the seeds of jealousy, Mohammed judiciously coupled his principal followers with the rights and obligations of brethren, and when Ali found himself without a peer, the prophet tenderly declared that he would be the companion and brother of the noble youth. The expedient was crowned with success. The holy fraternity was respected in peace and war, and the 2 parties vied with each other in a generous emulation of courage and fidelity. Only once the concord was slightly ruffled by an accidental quarrel. A patriot of Medina arraigned the insolence of the strangers, but the hint of their expulsion was heard with abhorrence, and his own son most eagerly offered to lay at the apostle's feet the head of his father. From the establishment at Medina, Mohammed assumed the exercise of the regal and sacerdotal office, and it was impious to appeal from a judge whose decrees were inspired by the divine wisdom. A small portion of ground, the patrimony of 2 orphans, was acquired by gift or purchase. On that chosen spot he built a house and a mosque, more venerable in their rude simplicity than the palaces and temples of the Assyrian caliphs. His seal of gold or silver was inscribed with the apostolic title. When he prayed and preached in the weekly assembly, he leaned against the trunk of a palm tree. it was long before he indulged himself in the use of a chair or pulpit of rough timber. After a reign of 6 years, 1,500 Moslems, in arms and in the field, renewed their oath of allegiance, and their chief repeated the assurance of protection till the death of the last member or the final dissolution of the party. It was in the same camp that the deputy of Mecca was astonished by the attention of the faithful to the words and looks of the prophet, by the eagerness with which they collected his spittle, a hair that dropped on the ground, the refuse water of his lustrations, as if they participated in some degree of the prophetic virtue. "I have seen," said he, "the Chosroes of Persia and the Caesar of Rome, but never did I behold a king among his subjects like Mohammed among his companions." The devout fervor of enthusiasm acts with more energy and truth than the cold and formal civility of courts. In the state of nature, every man has a right to defend, by force of arms, his person and his possessions, to repel, or even to prevent, the violence of his enemies, and to extend his hostilities to a reasonable measure of satisfaction and retaliation. In the free society of the Arabs, the duties of subject and citizen imposed a feeble restraint, and Mohammed, in the exercise of a peaceful and benevolent mission, had been despoiled and banished by the injustice of his countrymen. The choice of an independent people had exalted the fugitive of Mecca to the rank of a sovereign. He was invested with the just prerogative of forming alliances and waging offensive or defensive war. The imperfection of human rights was supplied and armed by the plenitude of divine power. The prophet of Medina assumed in his new revelations a fiercer and more sanguinary tone, which proves that his former moderation was the effect of weakness. The means of persuasion had been tried, the season of forbearance was elapsed, and he was now commanded to propagate his religion by the sword, and to destroy the monuments of idolatry, and, without regarding the sanctity of days or months, to pursue the unbelieving nations of the earth. The same bloody precepts, so repeatedly inculcated in the Koran, are ascribed by the author to the Pentateuch and the Gospel. But the mild tenor of the evangelic style may explain an ambiguous text, that Jesus did not bring peace on the earth, but a sword. His patient and humble virtues should not be confounded with the intolerant zeal of the princes and bishops, who have disgraced the name of his disciples. In the prosecution of religious war, Mohammed might appeal with more propriety to the example of Moses, of the judges, and the kings of Israel. The military laws of the Hebrews are still more rigid than those of the Arabian legislator. The Lord of hosts marched in person before the Jews. If a city resisted their summons, the males, without distinction, were put to the sword. The 7 nations of Canaan were devoted to destruction, and neither repentance nor conversion could shield them from the inevitable doom, that no creature within their precincts should be left alive. The fair option of friendship or submission, or battle, was proposed by the enemies of Mohammed. If they professed the creed of Islam, they were admitted to all the temporal and spiritual benefits of his primitive disciples, and marched under the same banner to extend the religion which they had embraced. The clemency of the prophet was decided by his interest, yet he seldom trampled on a prostrate enemy, and he seems to promise that on the payment of a tribute the least guilty of his unbelieving subjects might be indulged in their worship, or at least in their imperfect faith. In the first months of his reign he practised the lessons of holy warfare, and displayed his white banner before the gates of Medina. The martial apostle fought in person at 9 battles or sieges, and 50 enterprises of war were achieved in 10 years by himself or his lieutenants. The Arab continued to unite the professions of a merchant and a robber, and his petty excursions for the defence or the attack of a caravan insensibly prepared his troops for the conquest of Arabia. The distribution of the spoil was regulated by a divine law. The whole was faithfully collected in one common mass. A fifth of the gold and silver, the prisoners and cattle, the movables and immovables, were reserved by the prophet for pious and charitable uses. The remainder was shared in adequate portions by the soldiers who had attained the victory or guarded the camp. The rewards of the slain devolved to their widows and orphans, and the increase of cavalry was encouraged by the allotment of a double share to the horse and to the man. From all sides the roving Arabs were allured to the standard of religion and plunder. The apostle sanctified the license of embracing the female captives as their wives or concubines, and the enjoyment of wealth and beauty was a feeble type of the joys of paradise prepared for the valiant martyrs of the faith. "The sword," says Mahomet, "is the key of heaven and of hell. A drop of blood shed in the cause of God, a night spent in arms, is of more avail than 2 months of fasting or prayer. Whosoever falls in battle, his sins are forgiven. At the day of judgment his wounds shall be resplendent as vermilion, and odoriferous as musk, and the loss of his limbs shall be supplied by the wings of angels and the cherubim." The intrepid souls of the Arabs were fired with enthusiasm. The picture of the invisible world was strongly painted on their imagination, and the death which they had always despised became an object of hope and desire. The Koran inculcates in the most absolute sense the tenets of fate and predestination, which would extinguish both industry and virtue, if the actions of man were governed by a speculative belief. Yet their influence in every age has exalted the courage of the Saracens and Turks. The first companions of Mahomet advanced to battle with a fearless confidence. There is no danger where there is no chance. They were ordained to perish in their beds, or they were safe and invulnerable amidst the darts of the enemy. Perhaps the Koreish would have been content with the flight of Mahomet, had they not been provoked and alarmed by the vengeance of an enemy, who could intercept their Syrian trade as it passed and repassed through the territory of Medina. Abu Sophian himself, with only 30 or 40 followers, conducted a wealthy caravan of 1,000 camels. The fortune or dexterity of his march escaped the vigilance of Mahomet, but the chief of the Koreish was informed that the holy robbers were placed in ambush to await his return. He dispatched a messenger to his brethren of Mecca, and they were aroused by the fear of losing their merchandise and their provisions, unless they hastened to his relief with the military force of the city. The sacred band of Mahomet was formed of 313 Moslems, of whom 77 were fugitives and the rest auxiliaries. They mounted by turns a train of 70 camels. The camels of Yathrib were formidable in war, but such was the poverty of his first disciples that only 2 could appear on horseback in the field. In the fertile and famous vale of Beder, 3 stations from Medina, he was informed by his scouts of the caravan that approached on one side, of the Koreish, 100 horse, 850 foot, who advanced on the other. After a short debate, he sacrificed the prospect of wealth to the pursuit of glory and revenge, and a slight entrenchment was formed to cover his troops, and a stream of fresh water that glided through the valley. "O God!" he exclaimed, as the numbers of the Koreish descended from the hills, "O God! if these are destroyed, by whom wilt thou be worshipped on the earth? Courage, my children, close your ranks, discharge your arrows, and the day is your own." At these words he placed himself with Abu Bekr on a throne or pulpit, and instantly demanded the succor of Gabriel and 3,000 angels. His eye was fixed on the field of battle. The Mussulmans fainted and pressed. In that decisive moment the prophet started from his throne, mounted his horse, and cast a handful of sand into the air. "Let their faces be covered with confusion." Both armies heard the thunder of his voice. Their fancy beheld the angelic warriors. The Koreish trembled and fled. 70 of their bravest were slain, and 70 captives adorned the first victory of the faithful. The dead bodies of the Koreish were despoiled and insulted. 2 of the most obnoxious prisoners were punished with death, and the ransom of the others, 4,000 drachms of silver, compensated in some degree the escape of the caravan. But it was in vain that the camels of Abu Sophian explored a new road through the desert and along the Euphrates. They were overtaken by the diligence of the Mussulmans, and wealthy must have been the prize if 20,000 drachms could be set apart for the 5th of the apostle. The resentment of the public and private loss stimulated Abu Sophian to collect a body of 3,000 men, 700 of whom were armed with cuirasses, and 200 were mounted on horseback. 3,000 camels attended his march, and his wife Henda, with 15 matrons of Mecca, incessantly sounded their timbrels to animate the troops, and to magnify the greatness of Hobal, the most popular deity of the Kaaba. The standard of God and Mohammed was upheld by 950 believers. The disproportion of numbers was not more alarming than in the field of Beder, and the presumption of victory prevailed in the divine and human sense of the apostle. The second battle was fought on Mount Ohud, 6 miles to the north of Medina. The Koreish advanced in the form of a crescent, and the right wing of the cavalry was led by Khalid. the fiercest and most successful of the Arabian warriors. The troops of Mahomet were skilfully posted on the declivity of the hill, and their rear was guarded by a detachment of 50 archers. The weight of their charge impelled and broke the centre of the idolaters; but in the pursuit they lost the advantage of their ground. The archers deserted their station; the Mussulmans were tempted by the spoil, disobeyed their general, and disordered their ranks. The intrepid Caled, wielding his cavalry on their flank and rear, exclaimed with a loud voice that Mahomet was slain. He was indeed wounded in the face with a javelin; 2 of his teeth were shattered with a stone; yet, in the midst of tumult and dismay, he reproached the infidels with the murder of a prophet, and blessed the friendly hand that stanched the blood and conveyed him to a place of safety. 70 martyrs died for the sins of the people. They fell, said the apostle, in pairs, each brother embracing his lifeless companion. Their bodies were mangled by the inhuman females of Mecca, and the wife of Abu Sophian tasted the entrails of Hamza, the uncle of Mahomet. They might applaud their superstition and satiate their fury, but the Mussulmans soon rallied in the field, and the Koreish wanted strength or courage to undertake the siege of Medina. It was attacked the ensuing year by an army of 10,000 enemies, and this third expedition is variously named from the nations which marched under the banner of Abu Sophian, from the ditch which was drawn before the city, and a camp of 3,000 Mussulmans. The prudence of Mahomet declined a general engagement; the valor of Ali was signalized in single combat; and the war was protracted 20 days, till the final separation of the confederates. A tempest of wind, rain, and hail overturned their tents; their private quarrels were fomented by an insidious adversary; and the Koreish, deserted by their allies, no longer hoped to subvert the throne, or to check the conquests of their invincible exile. Chapter 50. Part 6 of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 5. This is the LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 5, Chapter 50, Part 6. The choice of Jerusalem for the first Qibla of prayer discovers the early propensity of Mohammed in favor of the Jews, and happy would it have been for their temporal interest had they recognized in the Arabian prophet the hope of Israel and the promised Messiah. Their obstinacy converted his friendship into implacable hatred, with which he pursued that unfortunate people to the last moment of his life, and in the double character of an apostle and a conqueror, his persecution was extended to both worlds. The Canoica dwelt at Medina under the protection of the city. He seized the occasion of an accidental tumult, and summoned them to embrace his religion or contend with him in battle. "Alas!" replied the trembling Jews, "we are ignorant of the use of arms, but we persevere in the faith and worship of our fathers. Why wilt thou reduce us to the necessity of a just defense?" The unequal conflict was terminated in 15 days, and it was with extreme reluctance that Mahomet yielded to the importunity of his allies, and consented to spare the lives of the captives. But their riches were confiscated, their arms became more effectual in the hands of the Mussulmans, and a wretched colony of 700 exiles was driven, with their wives and children, to implore a refuge on the confines of Syria. The Nadhirites were more guilty, since they conspired in a friendly interview to assassinate the prophet. He besieged their castle, 3 miles from Medina, but their resolute defence obtained an honorable capitulation, and the garrison, sounding their trumpets and beating their drums, was permitted to depart with the honors of war. The Jews had excited and joined the war of the Koreish. No sooner had the nations retired from the ditch, than Mahomet, without laying aside his armor, marched on the same day to extirpate the hostile race of the children of Koreada. After a resistance of 25 days, they surrendered at discretion. They trusted to the intercession of their old allies of Medina. They could not be ignorant that fanaticism obliterates the feelings of humanity. A venerable elder, to whose judgment they appealed, pronounced the sentence of their death. 700 Jews were dragged in chains to the market place of the city.
they descended alive into the grave prepared for their execution and burial, and the apostle beheld with an inflexible eye the slaughter of his helpless enemies. Their sheep and camels were inherited by the Mussulmans. 300 cuirasses, 500 pikes, 1,000 lances, composed the most useful portion of the spoil. 6 days' journey to the northeast of Medina, the ancient and wealthy town of Khaybar was the seat of the Jewish power in Arabia. The territory, a fertile spot in the desert, was covered with plantations and cattle, and protected by 8 castles, some of which were esteemed of impregnable strength. The forces of Mohammed consisted of 200 horse and 1,400 foot. In the succession of 8 regular and painful sieges, they were exposed to danger and fatigue and hunger, and the most undaunted chiefs despaired of the event. The apostle revived their faith and courage by the example of Ali, on whom he bestowed the surname of the Lion of God. Perhaps we may believe that a Hebrew champion of gigantic stature was cloven to the chest by his irresistible scimitar, but we cannot praise the modesty of romance, which represents him as tearing from its hinges the gate of a fortress, and wielding the ponderous buckler in his left hand. After the reduction of the castles, the town of Khaybar submitted to the yoke. The chief of the tribe was tortured, in the presence of Mohammed, to force a confession of his hidden treasure. The industry of the shepherds and husbandmen was rewarded with a precarious toleration. They were permitted, so long as it should please the conqueror, to improve their patrimony in equal shares for his emolument and their own. Under the reign of Omar, the Jews of Khaybar were transplanted to Syria, and the Caliph alleged the injunction of his dying master that one and the true religion should be professed in his native land of Arabia. 5 times each day the eyes of Mohammed were turned towards Mecca, and he was urged by the most sacred and powerful motives to revisit, as a conqueror, the city and the temple from whence he had been driven as an exile. The Kaaba was present to his waking and sleeping fancy. An idle dream was translated into vision and prophecy. He unfurled the holy banner, and a rash promise of success too hastily dropped from the lips of the apostle. His march from Medina to Mecca displayed the peaceful and solemn pomp of a pilgrimage. 70 camels, chosen and bedecked for sacrifice, preceded the van. The sacred territory was respected, and the captives were dismissed without ransom to proclaim his clemency and devotion. But no sooner did Mohammed descend into the plain, within a day's journey of the city, than he exclaimed, "They have clothed themselves with the skin of tigers." The numbers and resolution of the Koreish opposed his progress, and the roving Arabs of the desert might desert or betray a leader whom they had followed for the hopes of spoil. The intrepid fanatic sunk into a cool and cautious politician. He waived in the treaty his title of Apostle of God, concluded with the Koreish and their allies a truce of 10 years, engaged to restore the fugitives of Mecca who should embrace his religion, and stipulated only for the ensuing year the humble privilege of entering the city as a friend, and of remaining 3 days to accomplish the rites of the pilgrimage. A cloud of shame and sorrow hung on the retreat of the Mussulmans, and their disappointment might justly accuse the failure of a prophet who had so often appealed to the evidence of success. The faith and hope of the pilgrims were rekindled by the prospect of Mecca. Their swords were sheathed. 7 times in the footsteps of the apostle they encompassed the Kaaba. The Koreish had retired to the hills, and Mohammed, after the customary sacrifice, evacuated the city on the 4th day. The people was edified by his devotion. The hostile chiefs were awed, or divided, or seduced, and both Khalid and Amru, the future conquerors of Syria and Egypt, most seasonably deserted the sinking cause of idolatry. The power of Mohammed was increased by the submission of the Arabian tribes. 10,000 soldiers were assembled for the conquest of Mecca, and the idolaters, the weaker party, were easily convicted of violating the truce. Enthusiasm and discipline impelled the march, and preserved the secret, till the blaze of 10,000 fires proclaimed to the astonished Koreish the design, the approach, and the irresistible force of the enemy. The haughty Abu Sophian presented the keys of the city, admired the variety of arms and ensigns that passed before him in review, and observed that the son of Abdallah had acquired a mighty kingdom and confessed, under the scimitar of Omar, that he was the apostle of the true God. The return of Marius and Sulla was stained with the blood of the Romans. The revenge of Mahomet was stimulated by religious zeal, and his injured followers were eager to execute or to prevent the order of a massacre. Instead of indulging their passions and his own, the victorious exile forgave the guilt and united the factions of Mecca. His troops, in 3 divisions, marched into the city. 28 of the inhabitants were slain by the sword of Khalid. 11 men and 6 women were proscribed by the sentence of Mohammed, but he blamed the cruelty of his lieutenant, and several of the most obnoxious victims were indebted for their lives to his clemency or contempt. The chiefs of the Koreish were prostrate at his feet. "What mercy can you expect from the man whom you have wronged?" "We confide in the generosity of our kinsmen." "And you shall not confide in vain. Begone! You are safe. You are free." The people of Mecca deserved their pardon by the profession of Islam, and after an exile of 7 years, the fugitive missionary was enthroned as the prince and prophet of his native country. But the 360 idols of the Caaba were ignominiously broken. The house of God was purified and adorned, as an example to future times. The apostle again fulfilled the duties of a pilgrim, and a perpetual law was enacted that no unbeliever should dare set his foot on the territory of the holy city. The conquest of Mecca determined the faith and obedience of the Arabian tribes, who, according to the vicissitudes of fortune, had obeyed or disregarded the eloquence or the arms of the prophet. Indifference for rites and opinions still marks the character of the Bedowenes, and they might accept, as loosely as they hold, the doctrine of the Koran. The fugitives and auxiliaries complain that they who had borne the burden were neglected in the season of victory. "Alas," replied their artful leader, "suffer me to conciliate these recent enemies, these doubtful proselytes, by the gift of some perishable goods. To your guard I entrust my life and fortunes. You are the companions of my exile, of my kingdom, and of my paradise." He was followed by the deputies of Taif, who dreaded the repetition of a siege. "Grant us, O apostle of God, a truce of 3 years with the toleration of our ancient worship." "Not a month, not an hour." "Excuse us at least from the obligation of prayer." "Without prayer religion is of no avail." They submitted in silence. Their temples were demolished, and the same sentence was executed on all the idols of Arabia. His lieutenants on the shores of the Red Sea, the ocean, and the Gulf of Persia, were saluted by the acclamations of a faithful people, and the ambassadors who knelt before the throne of Medina were as numerous, says the Arabian proverb, as the dates that fall from the maturity of a palm tree. The nation submitted to the God and the sceptre of Mohammed. The opprobrious name of tribute was abolished. The spontaneous or reluctant oblations of alms and tithes were applied to the service of religion, and 114,000 Moslems accompanied the last pilgrimage of the apostle. When Heraclius returned in triumph from the Persian war, he entertained at Emesa one of the ambassadors of Mahomet, who invited the princes and nations of the earth to the profession of Islam. On this foundation, the zeal of the Arabians has supposed the secret conversion of the Christian emperor. The vanity of the Greeks has feigned a personal visit of the prince of Medina, who accepted from the royal bounty a rich domain and a secure retreat in the province of Syria. But the friendship of Heraclius and Mohammed was of short continuance. The new religion had inflamed rather than assuaged the rapacious spirit of the Saracens, and the murder of an envoy afforded a decent pretense for invading, with 3,000 soldiers, the territory of Palestine, that extends to the eastward of the Jordan. The holy banner was entrusted to Zeid, and such was the discipline or enthusiasm of the rising sect, that the noblest chiefs served without reluctance under the slave of the prophet. On the event of his decease, Ja'far and Abdallah were successively substituted to the command, and if the 3 should perish in the war, the troops were authorized to elect their general. The 3 leaders were slain in the battle of Mu'tah, the first military action which tried the valor of the Moslems against a foreign enemy. Zayd fell like a soldier in the foremost ranks. The death of Jaafar was heroic and memorable. He lost his right hand. He shifted the standard to his left. The left was severed from his body. He embraced the standard with his bleeding stumps, till he was transfixed to the ground with 50 honorable wounds. "Advance!" cried Abdallah, who stepped into the vacant place. "Advance with confidence! Either victory or paradise is our own." The lance of a Roman decided the alternative; but the falling standard was rescued by Khalid, the proselyte of Mecca. 9 swords were broken in his hand, and his valor withstood and repulsed the superior numbers of the Christians. In the nocturnal council of the camp he was chosen to command. His skilful evolutions of the ensuing day ensured either the victory or the retreat of the Saracens, and Khalid is renowned among his brethren and his enemies by the glorious appellation of the Sword of God. In the pulpit Mohammed described with prophetic rapture the crowns of the blessed martyrs, but in private he betrayed the feelings of human nature. He was surprised as he wept over the daughter of Zayd. "What do I see?" said the astonished votary. "You see," replied the apostle, "a friend who is deploring the loss of his most faithful friend." After the conquest of Mecca, the sovereign of Arabia affected to prevent the hostile preparations of Heraclius, and solemnly proclaimed war against the Romans, without attempting to disguise the hardships and dangers of the enterprise. The Moslems were discouraged. They alleged the want of money, of horses, of provisions, the season of harvest, and the intolerable heat of the summer. "Hell is much hotter," said the indignant prophet. He disdained to compel their service, but on his return he admonished the most guilty by an excommunication of 50 days. Their desertion enhanced the merit of Abubeker, Othman, and the faithful companions who devoted their lives and fortunes; and Mohammed displayed his banner at the head of 10,000 horse and 20,000 foot. Painful indeed was the distress of the march. Lassitude and thirst were aggravated by the scorching and pestilential winds of the desert. 10 men rode by turns on the same camel. They were reduced to the shameful necessity of drinking the water from the belly of that useful animal. In the midway, 10 days' journey from Medina to Damascus, they reposed near the grove and fountain of Tabuk. Beyond that place Mohammed declined the prosecution of the war. He declared himself satisfied with the peaceful intentions. He was more probably daunted by the martial army of the emperor of the East. But the active and intrepid Khalid spread around the terror of his name, and the prophet received the submission of the tribes and cities, from the Euphrates to Ilah at the head of the Red Sea. To his Christian subjects Mohammed readily granted the security of their persons, the freedom of their trade, the property of their goods, and the toleration of their worship. The weakness of their Arabian brethren had restrained them from opposing his ambition. The disciples of Jesus were endeared to the enemy of the Jews, and it was the interest of a conqueror to propose a fair capitulation to the most powerful religion of the earth. Till the age of 63 years, the strength of Mohammed was equal to the temporal and spiritual fatigues of his mission. His epileptic fits, an absurd calumny of the Greeks, would be an object of pity rather than abhorrence; but he seriously believed that he was poisoned at Khaybar by the revenge of a Jewish female. During 4 years the health of the prophet declined, his infirmities increased, but his mortal disease was a fever of 14 days, which deprived him by intervals of the use of reason. As soon as he was conscious of his danger, he edified his brethren by the humility of his virtue or penitence. "If there be any man," said the apostle from the pulpit, "whom I have unjustly scourged, I submit my own back to the lash of retaliation. Have I aspersed the reputation of a Mussulman? Let him proclaim my faults in the face of the congregation. Has any one been despoiled of his goods? The little that I possess shall compensate the principal and the interest of the debt." "Yes," replied a voice from the crowd, "I am entitled to 3 drachms of silver." Mohammed heard the complaint, satisfied the demand, and thanked his creditor for accusing him in this world rather than at the day of judgment. He beheld with temperate firmness the approach of death, enfranchised his slaves, 17 men, as they are named, and 11 women, minutely directed the order of his funeral, and moderated the lamentations of his weeping friends, on whom he bestowed the benediction of peace. Till the third day before his death, he regularly performed the function of public prayer. The choice of Abubeker to supply his place appeared to mark that ancient and faithful friend as his successor in the sacerdotal and regal office; but he prudently declined the risk and envy of a more explicit nomination. At a moment when his faculties were visibly impaired, he called for pen and ink to write, or more properly to dictate, a divine book, the sum and accomplishment of all his revelations. A dispute arose in the chamber whether he should be allowed to supersede the authority of the Koran, and the prophet was forced to reprove the indecent vehemence of his disciples. If the slightest credit may be afforded to the traditions of his wives and companions, he maintained in the bosom of his family, and to the last moments of his life, the dignity of an apostle and the faith of an enthusiast; described the visits of Gabriel, who bid an everlasting farewell to the earth; and expressed his lively confidence, not only of the mercy, but of the favor, of the Supreme Being. In a familiar discourse, he had mentioned his special prerogative, that the angel of death was not allowed to take his soul till he had respectfully asked the permission of the prophet. The request was granted, and Mahomet immediately fell into the agony of his dissolution. His head was reclined on the lap of Ayesha, the best beloved of all his wives. He fainted with the violence of pain. Recovering his spirits, he raised his eyes towards the roof of the house, and with a steady look, though a faltering voice, uttered the last broken, though articulate words: "O God, pardon my sins! Yes, I come among my fellow citizens on high," and thus peacefully expired on a carpet spread upon the floor. An expedition for the conquest of Syria was stopped by this mournful event. The army halted at the gates of Medina; the chiefs were assembled round their dying master. The city, more especially the house of the prophet, was a scene of clamorous sorrow or silent despair. Fanaticism alone could suggest a ray of hope and consolation. "How can he be dead? Our witness, our intercessor, our mediator with God? By God, he is not dead. Like Moses and Jesus, he is wrapped in a holy trance, and speedily he will return to his faithful people." The evidence of sense was disregarded, and Omar, unsheathing his scimitar, threatened to strike off the heads of the infidels who should dare to affirm that the prophet was no more. The tumult was appeased by the weight and moderation of Abubeker. "Is it Mohammed," said he to Omar and the multitude, "or the God of Mohammed whom you worship? The God of Mohammed liveth for ever, but the apostle was a mortal like ourselves, and, according to his own prediction, he has experienced the common fate of mortality." He was piously interred by the hands of his nearest kinsmen, on the same spot on which he expired. Medina has been sanctified by the death and the burial of Mahomet, and the innumerable pilgrims of Mecca often turn aside from the way to bow, in voluntary devotion, before the simple tomb of the prophet. At the conclusion of the life of Mahomet, it may perhaps be expected that I should balance his faults and virtues, that I should decide whether the title of enthusiast or impostor more properly belongs to that extraordinary man. Had I been intimately conversant with the son of Abdallah, the task would still be difficult, and the success uncertain. At the distance of 12 centuries, I darkly contemplate his shade through a cloud of religious incense; and could I truly delineate the portrait of an hour, the fleeting resemblance would not equally apply to the solitary of Mount Hera, to the preacher of Mecca, and to the conqueror of Arabia. The author of a mighty revolution appears to have been endowed with a pious and contemplative disposition. So soon as marriage had raised him above the pressure of want, he avoided the paths of ambition and avarice, and till the age of 40 he lived with innocence, and would have died without a name. The unity of God is an idea most congenial to nature and reason, and a slight conversation with the Jews and Christians would teach him to despise and detest the idolatry of Mecca. It was the duty of a man and a citizen to impart the doctrine of salvation, to rescue his country from the dominion of sin and error. The energy of a mind incessantly bent on the same object would convert a general obligation into a particular call. The warm suggestions of the understanding or the fancy would be felt as the inspirations of heaven, the labor of thought would expire in rapture and vision, and the inward sensation, the invisible monitor, would be described with the form and attributes of an angel of God. From enthusiasm to imposture the step is perilous and slippery. The demon of Socrates affords a memorable instance how a wise man may deceive himself, how a good man may deceive others, how the conscience may slumber in a mixed and middle state between self-illusion and voluntary fraud. Charity may believe that the original motives of Mahomet were those of pure and genuine benevolence, but a human missionary is incapable of cherishing the obstinate unbelievers who reject his claims, despise his arguments, and persecute his life. He might forgive his personal adversaries, he might lawfully hate the enemies of God. The stern passions of pride and revenge were kindled in the bosom of Mahomet, and he sighed, like the prophet of Nineveh, for the destruction of the rebels whom he had condemned. The injustice of Mecca and the choice of Medina transformed the citizen into a prince, the humble preacher into the leader of armies, but his sword was consecrated by the example of the saints. And the same God who afflicts a sinful world with pestilence and earthquakes might inspire for their conversion or chastisement the valor of his servants. In the exercise of political government he was compelled to abate of the stern rigor of fanaticism, to comply in some measure with the prejudices and passions of his followers, and to employ even the vices of mankind as the instruments of their salvation. The use of fraud and perfidy, of cruelty and injustice, were often subservient to the propagation of the faith, and Mahomet commanded or approved the assassination of the Jews and idolaters who had escaped from the field of battle. By the repetition of such acts the character of Mahomet must have been gradually stained, and the influence of such pernicious habits would be poorly compensated by the practice of the personal and social virtues which are necessary to maintain the reputation of a prophet among his sectaries and friends. Of his last years ambition was the ruling passion, and a politician will suspect that he secretly smiled, the victorious impostor, at the enthusiasm of his youth and the credulity of his proselytes. A philosopher will observe that their credulity and his success would tend more strongly to fortify the assurance of his divine mission, that his interest and religion were inseparably connected, and that his conscience would be soothed by the persuasion that he alone was absolved by the Deity from the obligation of positive and moral laws. If he retained any vestige of his native innocence, the sins of Mahomet may be allowed as an evidence of his sincerity. In the support of truth, the arts of fraud and fiction may be deemed less criminal, and he would have started at the foulness of the means, had he not been satisfied of the importance and justice of the end. Even in a conqueror or a priest, I can surprise a word or action of unaffected humanity, and the decree of Mahomet that, in the sale of captives, the mothers should never be separated from their children may suspend or moderate the censure of the historian. End of chapter 50, part 6. Chapter 50, part 7. Of the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, volume 5. Chapter 50, part 7. The good sense of Mohammed despised the pomp of royalty. The apostle of God submitted to the menial offices of the family. He kindled the fire, swept the floor, milked the ewes, and mended with his own hands his shoes and his woolen garment. Disdaining the penance and the merit of a hermit, he observed, without effort or vanity, the abstemious diet of an Arab and a soldier. On solemn occasions he feasted his companions with rustic and hospitable plenty, but in his domestic life many weeks would elapse without a fire being kindled on the hearth of the prophet. The interdiction of wine was confirmed by his example. His hunger was appeased with a sparing allowance of barley bread. He delighted in the taste of milk and honey, but his ordinary food consisted of dates and water. Perfumes and women were the two sensual enjoyments which his nature required, and his religion did not forbid; and Mahomet affirmed that the fervor of his devotion was increased by these innocent pleasures. The heat of the climate inflames the blood of the Arabs, and their libidinous complexion has been noticed by the writers of antiquity. Their incontinence was regulated by the civil and religious laws of the Koran; their incestuous alliances were blamed; the boundless license of polygamy was reduced to 4 legitimate wives or concubines; their rights, both of bed and of dowry, were equitably determined; and the freedom of divorce was discouraged. Adultery was condemned as a capital offence, and fornication in either sex was punished with 100 stripes. Such were the calm and rational precepts of the legislator; but in his private conduct Mahomet indulged the appetites of a man, and abused the claims of a prophet. A special revelation dispensed him from the laws which he had imposed on his nation. The female sex, without reserve, was abandoned to his desires; and this singular prerogative excited the envy rather than the scandal, the veneration rather than the envy, of the devout Mussulmans. If we remember the 700 wives and 300 concubines of the wise Solomon, we shall applaud the modesty of the Arabian, who espoused no more than 17 or 15 wives. 11 are enumerated, who occupied at Medina their separate apartments round the house of the apostle, and enjoyed in their turns the favor of his conjugal society. What is singular enough, that they were all widows, excepting only Ayesha, the daughter of Abubeker. She was doubtless a virgin, since Mahomet consummated his nuptials (such is the premature ripeness of the climate) when she was only 9 years of age. The youth, the beauty, and the spirit of Ayesha gave her a superior ascendant. She was beloved and trusted by the prophet; and, after his death, the daughter of Abubeker was long revered as the mother of the faithful. Her behavior has been ambiguous and indiscreet. In a nocturnal march she was accidentally left behind, and in the morning Ayesha returned to the camp with a man. The temper of Mahomet was inclined to jealousy, but a divine revelation assured him of her innocence. He chastised her accusers, and published a law of domestic peace, that no woman should be condemned unless 4 male witnesses had seen her in the act of adultery. In his adventures with Zaneb, the wife of Zayd, and with Mary, an Egyptian captive, the amorous prophet forgot the interests of his reputation. At the house of Zayd, his freedman and adopted son, he beheld, in a loose undress, the beauty of Zaynab, and burst forth into an ejaculation of devotion and desire. The servile or grateful freedman understood the hint, and yielded without hesitation to the love of his benefactor. But as the filial relation had excited some doubt and scandal, the angel Gabriel descended from heaven to ratify the deed, to annul the adoption, and to gently reprove the apostle for distrusting the indulgence of his God. One of his wives, Hafna, the daughter of Omar, surprised him on her own bed in the embraces of his Egyptian captive. She promised secrecy and forgiveness. He swore that he would renounce the possession of Mary. Both parties forgot their engagements, and Gabriel again descended with a chapter of the Koran to absolve him from his oath, and to exhort him freely to enjoy his captives and concubines, without listening to the clamors of his wives. In a solitary retreat of 30 days, he labored alone with Mary to fulfil the commands of the angel. When his love and revenge were satiated, he summoned to his presence his 11 wives, reproached their disobedience and indiscretion, and threatened them with the sentence of divorce, both in this world and in the next; a dreadful sentence, since those who had ascended the bed of the prophet were forever excluded from the hope of a second marriage. Perhaps the incontinence of Mahomet may be palliated by the tradition of his nocturnal or preternatural gifts. He united the manly virtue of 30 of the children of Adam, and the apostle might rival the 13th labor of the Grecian Hercules. A more serious and decent excuse may be drawn from his fidelity to Cadijah. During the 24 years of their marriage, her youthful husband abstained from the right of polygamy, and the pride or tenderness of the venerable matron was never insulted by the society of a rival. After her death, he placed her in the rank of the 4 perfect women, with the sister of Moses, the mother of Jesus, and Fatima, the best beloved of his daughters. Was she not old? Said Ayesha, with the insolence of a blooming beauty. Has not God given you a better in her place? No, by God, said Mahomet, with an effusion of honest gratitude, there can never be a better. She believed in me when men despised me. She relieved my wants when I was poor and persecuted by the world. In the largest indulgence of polygamy, the founder of a religion and empire might aspire to multiply the chances of a numerous posterity and a lineal succession. The hopes of Mahomet were fatally disappointed. The virgin Ayesha and his 10 widows of mature age and approved fertility were barren in his potent embraces. The 4 sons of Cadijah died in their infancy. Mary, his Egyptian concubine, was endeared to him by the birth of Ibrahim. At the end of 15 months the prophet wept over his grave, but he sustained with firmness the raillery of his enemies, and checked the adulation or credulity of the Moslems by the assurance that an eclipse of the sun was not occasioned by the death of the infant. Cadijah had likewise given him 4 daughters, who were married to the most faithful of his disciples. The 3 eldest died before their father, but Fatima, who possessed his confidence and love, became the wife of her cousin Ali, and the mother of an illustrious progeny. The merit and misfortunes of Ali and his descendants would lead me to anticipate in this place the series of the Saracen Caliphs, a title which describes the commanders of the faithful as the vicars and the successors of the Apostle of God. The birth, the alliance, the character of Ali, which exalted him above the rest of his countrymen, might justify his claim to the vacant throne of Arabia. The son of Abu Talib was in his own right the chief of the family of Hashim, and the hereditary prince or guardian of the city and temple of Mecca. The light of prophecy was extinct, but the husband of Fatima might expect the inheritance and the blessing of her father. The Arabs had sometimes been patient of a female reign, and the 2 grandsons of the prophet had been fondled in his lap, and shown in the pulpit as the hope of his age, and the chief of the youth of paradise. The first of the true believers might aspire to march before them in this world and in the next, and if some were of a more graver and more rigid cast, the zeal and virtue of Ali were never outstripped by any recent proselyte. He united the qualifications of a poet, a soldier, and a saint. His wisdom still breathes in a collection of moral and righteous sayings, and every antagonist in the combats of the tongue or the sword was subdued by his eloquence and valor. From the first hour of his mission to the last rites of his funeral, the apostle was never forsaken by a generous friend, whom he delighted to name his brother, his vice-regent, and the faithful Aaron of a second Moses. The son of Abu Talib was afterwards reproached for neglecting to secure his interest by a solemn declaration of his right, which would have silenced all competition, and sealed his succession by the decrees of heaven. But the unsuspecting hero confided in himself. The jealousy of empire, and perhaps the fear of opposition, might suspend the resolutions of Mahomet, and the bed of sickness was besieged by the artful Ayesha, the daughter of Abu Bekr, and the enemy of Ali. The silence and death of the prophet restored the liberty of the people, and his companions convened in assembly to deliberate on the choice of his successor. The hereditary claim and the lofty spirit of Ali were offensive to an aristocracy of elders, desirous of bestowing and resuming the sceptre by a free and frequent election. The Koreish could never be reconciled to the proud preeminence of the line of Hashim. The ancient discord of the tribes were rekindled. The fugitives of Mecca and the auxiliaries of Medina asserted their respective merits, and the rash proposal of choosing 2 independent caliphs would have crushed in their infancy the religion and the empire of the Saracens. The tumult was appeased by the disinterested resolution of Omar, who, suddenly renouncing his own pretensions, stretched forth his hand, and declared himself the first subject of the mild and venerable Abu Bekr. The urgency of the moment, and the acquiescence of the people, might excuse this illegal and precipitate measure; but Omar himself confessed from the pulpit, that, if any Mussulman should hereafter presume to anticipate the suffrage of his brethren, both the elector and the elected would be worthy of death. After the simple inauguration of Abu Bekr, he was obeyed in Medina, Mecca, and the provinces of Arabia. The Hashemites alone declined the oath of fidelity, and their chief in his own house maintained above 6 months a sullen and independent reserve, without listening to the threats of Omar, who attempted to consume with fire the habitation of the daughter of the apostle. The death of Fatima, and the decline of his party, subdued the indignant spirit of Ali. He condescended to salute the commander of the faithful, and accepted his excuse of the necessity of preventing their common enemies, and wisely rejected his courteous offer of abdicating the government of the Arabians. After a reign of 2 years, the aged caliph was summoned by the angel of death. In his testament, with the tacit approbation of the companions, he bequeathed the sceptre to the firm and intrepid virtue of Omar. "I have no occasion," said the modest candidate, "for the place." "But the place has occasion for you," replied Abubeker, who expired with a fervent prayer that the God of Mahomet would ratify his choice, and direct the Mussulmans in the way of concord and obedience. The prayer was not ineffectual, since Ali himself, in a life of privacy and prayer, professed to revere the superior worth and dignity of his rival, who comforted him with the loss of empire by the most flattering marks of confidence and esteem. In the 12th year of his reign, Omar received a mortal wound from the hand of an assassin. He rejected with equal impartiality the names of his son and of Ali, refused to load his conscience with the sins of his successor, and devolved on 6 of the most respectable companions the arduous task of electing a commander of the faithful. On this occasion Ali was again blamed by his friends for submitting his right to the judgment of men, for recognizing their jurisdiction by accepting a place among the 6 electors. He might have obtained their suffrage, had he deigned to promise a strict and servile conformity, not only to the Koran and the tradition, but likewise to the determination of the 2 signors. With these limitations, Othman, the secretary of Mahomet, accepted the government. Nor was it till after the 3rd caliph, 24 years after the death of the Prophet, that Ali was invested by the popular choice with the regal and sacerdotal office. The manners of the Arabians retained their primitive simplicity, and the son of Abu Talib despised the pomp and vanity of this world. At the hour of prayer he repaired to the mosque of Medina, clothed in a thin cotton gown, a coarse turban on his head, his slippers in one hand, his bow in the other, instead of a walking staff. The companions of the Prophet and the chiefs of the tribe saluted their new sovereign, and gave him their right hands as a sign of fealty and allegiance. The mischiefs that flow from the conquests of ambition are usually confined to the times and countries in which they have been agitated. But the religious discord of the friends and enemies of Ali have been renewed in every age of the Hegira, and is still maintained in the immortal hatred of the Persians and Turks. The former, who are branded with the appellation of Shiites or sectaries, have enriched the Mahometan creed with a new article of faith; and if Mahomet be the apostle, his companion Ali is the vicar of God. In their private concourse, in their public worship, they bitterly execrate the 3 usurpers who intercepted his indefeasible right to the dignity of Imam and Caliph, and the name of Omar expresses in their tongue the perfect accomplishment of wickedness and impiety. The Sonnites, who are supported by the general consent and orthodox tradition of the Mussulmans, entertain a more impartial, or at least a more decent opinion. They respect the memory of Abubeker, Omar, Othman, and Ali, the holy and legitimate successors of the Prophet, but they assign the last and most humble place to the husband of Fatima, in the persuasion that the order of succession was determined by the degrees of sanctity. An historian, who balances the 4 caliphs with a hand unshaken by superstition, will calmly pronounce that their manners were alike pure and exemplary, that their zeal was fervent and probably sincere, and that, in the midst of riches and power, their lives were devoted to the practice of moral and religious duties. But the public virtues of Abubeker and Omar, the prudence of the first, the severity of the second, maintained the peace and prosperity of their reigns. The feeble temper and declining age of Othman were incapable of sustaining the weight of conquest and empire. He chose and was deceived; he trusted and he was betrayed. The most deserving of the faithful became useless or hostile to his government, and his lavish bounty was productive only of ingratitude and discontent. The spirit of discord went forth in the provinces. Their deputies assembled at Medina, and the Charegites, the desperate fanatics who disclaimed the yoke of subordination and reason, were confounded among the free born Arabs, who demanded the redress of their wrongs and the punishment of their oppressors. From Cufa, from Bassora, from Egypt, from the tribes of the desert, they rose in arms, encamped about a league from Medina, and dispatched a haughty mandate to their sovereign, requiring him to execute justice, or to descend from the throne. His repentance began to disarm and disperse the insurgents; but their fury was rekindled by the arts of his enemies, and the forgery of a perfidious secretary was contrived to blast his reputation and precipitate his fall. The caliph had lost the only guard of his predecessors, the esteem and confidence of the Moslems. During a siege of 6 weeks, his water and provisions were intercepted, and the feeble gates of the palace were protected only by the scruples of the more timorous rebels. Forsaken by those who had abused his simplicity, the helpless and venerable caliph expected the approach of death. The brother of Ayesha marched at the head of the assassins, and Othman, with the Koran in his lap, was pierced with a multitude of wounds. A tumultuous anarchy of 5 days was appeased by the inauguration of Ali. His refusal would have provoked a general massacre. In this painful situation, he supported the becoming pride of the chief of the Hashemites, declared that he had rather serve than reign, rebuked the presumption of the strangers, and required the formal, if not the voluntary, assent of the chiefs of the nations. He has never been accused of prompting the assassination of Omar, though Persia indiscreetly celebrates the festival of that holy martyr. The quarrel between Othman and his subjects was assuaged by the early mediation of Ali, and Hassan, the eldest of his sons, was insulted and wounded in the defence of the caliph. Yet it is doubtful whether the father of Hassan was strenuous and sincere in his opposition to the rebels, and it is certain that he enjoyed the benefit of their crime. The temptation was indeed of such magnitude as might stagger and corrupt the most obdurate virtue. The ambitious candidate no more aspired to the barren sceptre of Arabia. The Saracens had been victorious in the East and West, and the wealthy kingdoms of Persia, Syria, and Egypt were the patrimony of the commander of the faithful. End of chapter 50, part 7. Chapter 50, part 8 of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, volume 5. Chapter 50, part 8. A life of prayer and contemplation had not chilled the martial activity of Ali, but in a mature age, after a long experience of mankind, he still betrayed in his conduct the rashness and indiscretion of youth. In the first days of his reign, he neglected to secure, either by gifts or fetters, the doubtful allegiance of Telha and Zobeir, 2 of the most powerful of the Arabian chiefs. They escaped from Medina to Mecca, and thence to Bassora, erected the standard of revolt, and usurped the government of Irak, or Assyria, which they had vainly solicited as the reward of their services. The mask of patriotism is allowed to cover the most glaring inconsistencies, and the enemies, perhaps the assassins of Othman, now demanded the vengeance for his blood. They were accompanied in their flight by Ayesha, the widow of the Prophet, who cherished to the last hour of her life an implacable hatred against the husband and posterity of Fatima. The most reasonable Moslems were scandalized that the mother of the faithful should expose in a camp her person and character, but the superstitious crowd was confident that her presence would sanctify the justice and assure the success of their cause. At the head of 20,000 of his loyal Arabs and 9,000 valiant auxiliaries of Cufa, the caliph encountered and defeated the superior numbers of the rebels under the walls of Bassora. Their leaders, Telha and Zobeir, were slain in the first battle that stained with civil blood the arms of the Moslems. After passing through the ranks to animate the troops, Ayesha had chosen her post amidst the dangers of the field. In the heat of the action, 70 men who held the bridle of her camel were successively killed or wounded, and the cage or litter in which she sat was stuck with javelins and darts like the quills of a porcupine. The venerable captive sustained with firmness the reproaches of the conqueror, and speedily dismissed to her proper station at the tomb of Mahomet, with the respect and tenderness that was still due to the widow of the apostle. After this victory, which was styled the day of the camel, Ali marched against a more formidable adversary, against Moawiyah, the son of Abu Sophian, who had assumed the title of caliph, and whose claim was supported by the forces of Syria and the interests of the house of Ommiyah. From the passage of Thapsacus, the plain of Sufin extends along the western bank of the Euphrates. On this spacious and level theatre the two competitors waged a desultory war of 110 days. In the course of 90 actions or skirmishes, the loss of Ali was estimated at 25, that of Moawiyah at 45,000 soldiers, and the list of the slain was dignified with the names of 25 veterans who had fought at Bedr under the standard of Mohammed. In this sanguinary contest, the lawful caliph displayed a superior character of valor and humanity. His troops were strictly enjoined to await the first onset of the enemy, to spare their flying brethren, and to respect the bodies of the dead, and the chastity of the female captives. He generously proposed to save the blood of the Moslems by a single combat, but his trembling rival declined the challenge as a sentence of inevitable death. The ranks of the Syrians were broken by a charge of a hero who was mounted on a piebald horse, and wielded with irresistible force his ponderous and two-edged sword. As often as he smote a rebel, he shouted the Allah Akbar, God is victorious, and in the tumult of a nocturnal battle he was heard to repeat 400 times that tremendous exclamation. The prince of Damascus already meditated his flight, but the certain victory was snatched from the grasp of Ali by the disobedience and enthusiasm of his troops. Their conscience was awed by the solemn appeal to the books of the Koran, which Moawiyah exposed on the foremost lances, and Ali was compelled to yield to a disgraceful truce and an insidious compromise. He retreated with sorrow and indignation to Cufa. His party was discouraged. The distant provinces of Persia, of Yemen, and of Egypt were subdued or seduced by his crafty rival; and the stroke of fanaticism, which was aimed against the three chiefs of the nation, was fatal only to the cousin of Mahomet. In the temple of Mecca, 3 Charegites, or enthusiasts, discoursed on the disorders of the church and state; and they soon agreed that the deaths of Ali, of Moawiyah, and of his friend Amru, the vice-regent of Egypt, would restore the peace and unity of religion. Each of the assassins chose his victim, poisoned his dagger, devoted his life, and secretly repaired to the scene of action. Their resolution was equally desperate; but the first mistook the person of Amru, and stabbed the deputy who occupied his seat. The prince of Damascus was dangerously hurt by the second. The lawful caliph, in the mosque of Cufa, received a mortal wound from the hand of the third. He expired in the 63rd year of his age, and mercifully recommended to his children that they would despatch the murderer by a single stroke. The sepulchre of Ali was concealed from the tyrants of the house of Ommiyah, but in the 4th age of the Hegira, a tomb, a temple, a city, arose near the ruins of Cufa. Many thousands of the Shiites repose in holy ground at the feet of the Vicar of God, and the desert is vivified by the numerous and annual visits of the Persians, who esteem their devotion not less meritorious than the pilgrimage of Mecca. The persecutors of Mohammed usurped the inheritance of his children, and the champions of idolatry became the supreme heads of his religion and empire. The opposition of Abu Sophian had been fierce and obstinate; his conversion was tardy and reluctant; his new faith was fortified by necessity and interest. He served, he fought, perhaps he believed, and the sins of the time of ignorance were expiated by the recent merits of the family of Ommiyah. Moawiyah, the son of Abu Sophian and of the cruel Henda, was dignified in his early youth with the office or title of secretary of the prophet. The judgment of Omar entrusted him with the government of Syria. He administered that important province above 40 years, either in a subordinate or supreme rank. Without renouncing the fame of valor and liberality, he affected the reputation of humanity and moderation. A grateful people was attached to their benefactor, and the victorious Moslems were enriched with the spoils of Cyprus and Rhodes. The sacred duty of pursuing the assassins of Othman was the engine and pretence of his ambition. The bloody shirt of the martyr was exposed in the mosque of Damascus. The emir deplored the fate of his injured kinsman, and 60,000 Syrians were engaged in his service by an oath of fidelity and revenge. Amrou, the conqueror of Egypt, himself an army, was the first who saluted the new monarch, and divulged the dangerous secret that the Arabian caliphs might be created elsewhere than in the city of the Prophet. The policy of Moawiyah eluded the valor of his rival, and after the death of Ali, he negotiated the abdication of his son Hassan, whose mind was either above or below the government of the world, and who retired without a sigh from the palace of Cufa to a humble cell near the tomb of his grandfather. The aspiring wishes of the caliph were finally crowned by the important change of an elective to an hereditary kingdom. Some murmurs of freedom or fanaticism attested the reluctance of the Arabs, and 4 citizens of Medina refused their oath of fidelity. But the designs of Moawiyah were conducted with vigor and address, and his son Yezid, a feeble and dissolute youth, was proclaimed as the commander of the faithful and the successor of the apostle of God. A familiar story is related of the benevolence of one of the sons of Ali. In serving at table, a slave had inadvertently dropped a dish of scalding broth on his master. The heedless wretch fell prostrate to deprecate his punishment, and repeated a verse of the Koran: "Paradise is for those who command their anger. I am not angry. And for those who pardon offenses, I pardon your offense. And for those who return good for evil, I give you your liberty and 400 pieces of silver." With an equal measure of piety, Hosein, the younger brother of Hassan, inherited the remnant of his father's spirit, and served with honor against the Christians in the siege of Constantinople. The primogeniture of the line of Hashim, and the holy character of the grandson of the apostle, had centered in his person, and he was at liberty to prosecute his claim against Yezid, the tyrant of Damascus, whose vices he despised, and whose title he had never deigned to acknowledge. A list was secretly transmitted from Cufa to Medina, of 140,000 Moslems who professed their attachment to his cause, and who were eager to draw their swords as soon as he should appear on the banks of the Euphrates. Against the advice of his wisest friends, he resolved to trust his person and family in the hands of a perfidious people. He traversed the desert of Arabia with a timorous retinue of women and children, but as he approached the confines of Irak, he was alarmed by the solitary or hostile face of the country, and suspected either the defection or ruin of his party. His fears were just. Obeidallah, the governor of Cafu, had extinguished the first sparks of an insurrection, and Hosein, on the plain of Kerbela, was encompassed by a body of 5,000 horse, who intercepted his communication with the city and the river. He might still have escaped to a fortress in the desert that had defied the power of Caesar and Chosroes, and confided in the fidelity of the tribe of Tai, who would have armed 10,000 warriors in his defense. In a conference with the chief of the enemy, he proposed the option of 3 honorable conditions: that he should be allowed to return to Medina, or be stationed in a frontier garrison against the Turks, or safely conducted to the presence of Yezid. But the commands of the caliph or his lieutenant were stern and absolute, and Hosein was informed that he must either submit as a captive and criminal to the commander of the faithful, or expect the consequences of his rebellion. "Do you think," replied he, "to terrify me with death?" And during the short respite of a night, he prepared with calm and solemn resignation to encounter his fate. He checked the lamentations of his sister Fatima, who deplored the impending ruin of his house. "Our trust," said Hosein, "is in God alone. All things, both in heaven and earth, must perish and return to their Creator. My brother, my father, my mother were better than me, and every Mussulman has an example in the Prophet." He pressed his friends to consult their safety by a timely flight. They unanimously refused to desert or survive their beloved master, and their courage was fortified by a fervent prayer and the assurance of paradise. On the morning of the fatal day, he mounted on horseback, with his sword in one hand and the Koran in the other. His generous band of martyrs consisted only of 32 horse and 40 foot, but their flanks and rear were secured by the tent ropes and by a deep trench, which they had filled with lighted faggots, according to the practice of the Arabs. The enemy advanced with reluctance, and one of their chiefs deserted, with 30 followers, to claim the partnership of inevitable death. And in every close onset or single combat, the despair of the Fatimites was invincible; but the surrounding multitudes galled them from a distance with a cloud of arrows, and the horses and men were successively slain. A truce was allowed on both sides for the hour of prayer, and the battle at length expired by the death of the last of the companions of Hosein. Alone, weary, and wounded, he seated himself at the door of his tent. As he tasted a drop of water, he was pierced in the mouth with a dart, and his son and nephew, two beautiful youths, were killed in his arms. He lifted his hands to heaven; they were full of blood, and he uttered a funeral prayer for the living and the dead. In a transport of despair, his sister issued from the tent, and adjured the general of the Cufians that he would not suffer Hosein to be murdered before his eyes. A tear trickled down his venerable beard, and the boldest of his soldiers fell back on every side as the dying hero threw himself among them. The remorseless Shammar, a name detested by the faithful, reproached their cowardice, and the grandson of Mohammed was slain with 33 strokes of lances and swords. After they had trampled on his body, they carried his head to the castle of Cufa, and the inhuman Obeidollah struck him on the mouth with a cane. "Alas!" exclaimed an aged Mussulman, "on those lips I have seen the lips of the apostle of God." In a distant age and climate, the tragic scene of the death of Hosein will awaken the sympathy of the coldest reader. On the annual festival of his martyrdom, in the devout pilgrimage to his sepulchre, his Persian votaries abandoned their souls to the religious frenzy of sorrow and indignation. When the sisters and children of Ali were brought in chains to the throne of Damascus, the caliph was advised to extirpate the enmity of a popular and hostile race, whom he had injured beyond the hope of reconciliation. But Yezid preferred the counsels of mercy, and the mourning family was honorably dismissed to mingle their tears with their kindred at Medina. The glory of martyrdom superseded the right of primogeniture, and the 12 imams, or pontiffs, of the Persian creed are Ali, Hassan, Husain, and the lineal descendants of Husain to the 9th generation. Without arms, or treasures, or subjects, they successively enjoyed the veneration of the people, and provoked the jealousy of the reigning caliphs. Their tombs at Mecca or Medina, on the banks of the Euphrates, or in the province of Khorasan, are still visited by the devotion of their sect. Their names are often the pretense of sedition and civil war; but these royal saints despised the pomp of the world, submitted to the will of God and the injustice of man, and devoted their innocent lives to the study and the practice of religion. The 12th and last of the imams, conspicuous by the title of Madahi, or guide, surpassed the solitude and sanctity of his predecessors. He concealed himself in a cave near Baghdad. The time and place of his death are uncertain, and his votaries pretend that he still lives, and will appear before the day of judgment to overthrow the dynasty of Dajjal, or the Antichrist. In the lapse of 2 or 3 centuries, the posterity of Abbas, the uncle of Mahomet, had multiplied to the number of 33,000. The race of Ali might be equally prolific. The meanest individual was above the first and greatest of princes, and the most eminent were supposed to excel the perfection of angels. But their adverse fortune, and the wide extent of the Mussulman empire, allowed an ample scope for every bold and artful impostor who claimed affinity with the holy seed. The sceptre of the Almohades in Spain and Afric, of the Fatimites in Egypt and Syria, of the sultans of Yemen, and the sophists of Persia, had been consecrated by this vague and ambiguous title. Under their reigns, it might be dangerous to dispute the legitimacy of their birth, and one of the Fatimite caliphs silenced an indiscreet question by drawing his scimitar. "This," said Moez, "is my pedigree, and these," casting a handful of gold to his soldiers, "and these are my kindred and my children." In the various conditions of princes, or doctors, or nobles, or merchants, or beggars, a swarm of the genuine or fictitious descendants of Mohammed and Ali is honored with the appellation of sheikhs, or sherifs, or emirs. In the Ottoman empire they are distinguished by a green turban, receive a stipend from the treasury, are judged only by their chief, and, however debased by fortune or character, still assert the proud preeminence of their birth. A family of 300 persons, the pure and orthodox branch of the Caliph Hassan, is preserved without taint or suspicion in the holy cities of Medina and Mecca, and still retains, after the revolutions of 12 centuries, the custody of the temple, and the sovereignty of their native land. The fame and merit of Mahomet would ennoble a plebeian race; and the ancient blood of the Koreish transcends the recent majesty of the kings of the earth. The talents of Mahomet are entitled to our applause; but his success has, perhaps, too strongly. Are we surprised that a multitude of proselytes should embrace the doctrine and the passions of an eloquent fanatic? In the heresies of the church, the same seduction has been tried and repeated from the time of the apostles to that of the reformers. Does it seem incredible that a private citizen should grasp the sword and the sceptre, subdue his native country, and erect a monarchy by his victorious arms? In the moving picture of the dynasties of the East, 100 fortunate usurpers have arisen from a baser origin, surmounted more formidable obstacles, and filled a larger scope of empire and conquest. Mahomet was alike instructed to preach and to fight; and the union of those opposite qualities, while it enhanced his merit, contributed to his success. The operation of force and persuasion, of enthusiasm and fear, continually acted on each other, till every barrier yielded to their irresistible power. His voice invited the Arabs to freedom and victory, to arms and rapine, to the indulgence of their darling passions in this world and the other; and the restraints which he imposed were requisite to establish the credit of the prophet, and to exercise the obedience of the people; and the only objection to his success was his rational creed of the unity and perfections of God. It is not the propagation, but the permanency of his religion that deserves our wonder. The same pure and perfect impression which he engraved at Mecca and Medina is still preserved, after the revolution of 12 centuries, by the Indian, the African, and the Turkish proselytes of the Koran. If the Christian apostles, St. Peter or St. Paul, could return to the Vatican, they might possibly inquire the name of the deity who is worshipped with such mysterious rites in that magnificent temple. At Oxford or Geneva they would experience less surprise, but it would still be incumbent on them to peruse the catechism of the church, and to study the orthodox commentators on their own writings, and the words of their master. But the Turkish dome of St. Sophia, with an increase of splendor and size, represents the humble tabernacle erected at Medina by the hands of Mahomet. The Mohammedans have uniformly withstood the temptation of reducing the object of their faith and devotion to a level with the senses and imagination of man. "I believe in one God, and Mohammed is the apostle of God," is the simple and invariable profession of Islam. The intellectual image of the deity has never been degraded by any visible idol. The honors of the prophet have never transgressed the measure of human virtue, and his living precepts have restrained the gratitude of his disciples within the bounds of reason and religion. The votaries of Ali have, indeed, consecrated the memory of their hero, his wife, and his children, and some of the Persian doctors pretend that the divine essence was incarnate in the person of the Imams. But their superstition is universally condemned by the Sonnites, and their impiety has afforded a seasonable warning against the worship of saints and martyrs. The metaphysical questions on the attributes of God and the liberty of man have been agitated in the schools of the Mohammedans as well as those of the Christians, but among the former they have never engaged the passions of the people or disturbed the tranquillity of the state. The cause of this important difference may be found in the separation or union of the regal and sacerdotal characters. It was the interest of the caliphs, the successors of the prophet, and the commanders of the faithful, to repress and discourage all religious innovations. The order, the discipline, the temporal and spiritual ambition of the clergy are unknown to the Moslems, and the sages of the law are the guides of their conscience and the oracles of their faith. From the Atlantic to the Ganges, the Koran is acknowledged as the fundamental code, not only of theology, but of civil and criminal jurisprudence; and the laws which regulate the actions and the property of mankind are guarded by the infallible and immutable sanction of the will of God. This religious servitude is attended with some practical disadvantage. The illiterate legislator has been often misled by his own prejudices and those of his country, and the institutions of the Arabian desert may be ill adapted to the wealth and numbers of Ispahan and Constantinople. On these occasions the Cadi respectfully places on his head the holy volume, and substitutes a dexterous interpretation more apposite to the principles of equity and the manners and policy of the times. His beneficial or pernicious influence on the public happiness is the last consideration in the character of Mahomet. The most bitter and most bigoted of his Christian or Jewish foes will surely allow that he assumed a false commission to inculcate a salutary doctrine, less perfect only than their own. He piously supposed as the basis of his religion the truth and sanctity of their prior revelations, the virtues and miracles of their founders. The idols of Arabia were broken before the throne of God, and the blood of human victims was expiated by prayer and fasting and alms, the laudable or innocent arts of devotion, and his rewards and punishments of a future life were painted by the images most congenial to an ignorant and carnal generation. Mohammed was, perhaps, incapable of dictating a moral and political system for the use of his countrymen, but he breathed among the faithful a spirit of charity and friendship, recommended the practice of social virtues, and checked by his laws and precepts the thirst of revenge and the oppression of widows and orphans. The hostile tribes were united in faith and obedience, and the valor which had been idly spent in domestic quarrels was vigorously directed against a foreign enemy. Had the impulse been less powerful, Arabia, free at home and formidable abroad, might have flourished under a succession of her native monarchs. Her sovereignty was lost by the extent and rapidity of conquest. The colonies of the nation were scattered over the east and west, and their blood was mingled with the blood of their converts and captives. After the reign of 3 caliphs, the throne was transported from Medina to the valley of Damascus and the banks of the Tigris, and the holy cities were violated by impious war. Arabia was ruled by the rod of a subject, perhaps of a stranger, and the Bedouins of the desert, awakening from their dream of dominion, resumed their old and solitary independence. End of chapter 50, part 8.
Chapter 51, Part 1 of the History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Corey Samuel. The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 5, by Edward Gibbon. Chapter 51, Conquests by the Arabs, Part 1. The revolution of Arabia had not changed the character of the Arabs. The death of Mahomet was the signal of independence, and the hasty structure of his power and religion tottered to its foundations. A small and faithful band of his primitive disciples had listened to his eloquence and shared his distress, had fled with the apostle from the persecution of Mecca, or had received the fugitive in the walls of Medina. The increasing myriads who acknowledged Mahomet as their king and prophet had been compelled by his arms or allured by his prosperity. The polytheists were confounded by the simple idea of a solitary and invisible God. The pride of the Christians and Jews disdained the yoke of a mortal and contemporary legislator. The habits of faith and obedience were not sufficiently confirmed, and many of the new converts regretted the venerable antiquity of the law of Moses, or the rites and mysteries of the Catholic Church, or the idols, the sacrifices, the joyous festivals of their pagan ancestors. The jarring interests and hereditary feuds of the Arabian tribes had not yet coalesced in a system of union and subordination, and the barbarians were impatient of the mildest and most salutary laws that curbed their passions or violated their customs. They submitted with reluctance to the religious precepts of the Koran, the abstinence from wine, the fast of the Ramadan, and the daily repetition of 5 prayers, and the alms and tithes which were collected for the treasury of Medina could be distinguished only by a name from the payment of a perpetual and ignominious tribute. The example of Mahomet had excited a spirit of fanaticism or imposture, and several of his rivals presumed to imitate the conduct and to defy the authority of the living prophet. At the head of the fugitives and auxiliaries, the first caliph was reduced to the cities of Mecca, Medina, and Taif, and perhaps the Koreish would have restored the idols of the Kaaba if their levity had not been checked by a seasonable reproof. ye men of Mecca, will ye be the last to embrace, and the first to abandon, the religion of Islam?" After exhorting the Moslems to confide in the aid of God and his apostle, Abubeker resolved, by a vigorous attack, to prevent the junction of the rebels. The women and children were safely lodged in the cavities of the mountains. The warriors, marching under 11 banners, diffused the terror of their arms, and the appearance of a military force revived and confirmed the loyalty of the faithful. The inconstant tribes accepted with humble repentance the duties of prayer and fasting and arms, and, after some examples of success and severity, the most daring apostates fell prostrate before the sword of the Lord and of Khalid. In the fertile province of Yemanah, between the Red Sea and the Gulf of Persia, in a city not inferior to Medina itself, a powerful chief, his name was Musaylama, had assumed the character of a prophet, and the tribe of Hanifa listened to his voice. A female prophetess was attracted by his reputation. The decencies of words and actions were spurned by these favourites of heaven, and they employed several days in mystic and amorous converse. An obscure sentence of his Koran or book is yet extant, and in the pride of his mission Musaylama condescended to offer a partition of the earth. The proposal was answered by Mahomet with contempt, but the rapid progress of the impostor awakened the fears of his successor. 40,000 Moslems were assembled under the standard of Khalid, and the existence of their faith was resigned to the event of a decisive battle. In the first action they were repulsed by the loss of 1,200 men, but the skill and perseverance of their general prevailed. Their defeat was avenged by the slaughter of 10,000 infidels, and Musaylama himself was pierced by an Ethiopian slave with the same javelin which had mortally wounded the uncle of Mahomet. The various rebels of Arabia, without a chief or a cause, were speedily suppressed by the power and discipline of the rising monarchy, and the whole nation again professed, and more steadfastly held, the religion of the Koran. The ambition of the caliphs provided an immediate exercise for the restless spirit of the Saracens. Their valour was united in the prosecution of a holy war, and their enthusiasm was equally confirmed by opposition and victory. From the rapid conquests of the Saracens, a presumption will naturally arise that the caliphs commanded in person the armies of the faithful, and sought the crown of martyrdom in the foremost ranks of the battle. The courage of Abubeker, Omar, and Othman had indeed been tried in the persecution and wars of the Prophet, and the personal assurance of paradise must have taught them to despise the pleasures and dangers of the present world. But they ascended the throne in a venerable or mature age, and esteemed the domestic cares of religion and justice the most important duties of a sovereign. Except the presence of Omar at the siege of Jerusalem, their longest expeditions were the frequent pilgrimage from Medina to Mecca, and they calmly received the tidings of victory as they prayed or preached before the sepulchre of the Prophet. The austere and frugal measure of their lives was the effect of virtue or habit, and the pride of their simplicity insulted the vain magnificence of the kings of the earth. When Abubeker assumed the office of caliph, he enjoined his daughter Aisha to take a strict account of his private patrimony, that it might be evident whether he were enriched or impoverished by the service of the state. He thought himself entitled to a stipend of 3 pieces of gold, with the sufficient maintenance of a single camel and a black slave, but on the Friday of each week he distributed the residue of his own and the public money, first to the most worthy, and then to the most indigent of the Moslems. The remains of his wealth, a coarse garment and 5 pieces of gold, were delivered to his successor, who lamented with a modest sigh his own inability to equal such an admirable model. Yet the abstinence and humility of Omar were not inferior to the virtues of Abubeker. His food consisted of barley bread or dates, his drink was water. He preached in a gown that was torn or tattered in 12 places, and the Persian satrap, who paid his homage to the conqueror, found him asleep among the beggars on the steps of the mosque of Medina. Economy is the source of liberality, and the increase of the revenue enabled Omar to establish a just and perpetual reward for the past and present services of the faithful. Careless of his own emolument, he assigned to Abbas, the uncle of the Prophet, the first and most ample allowance of 25,000 drams or pieces of silver. 5,000 were allotted to each of the aged warriors, the relics of the field of Badr, and the last and meanest of the companions of Mahomet was distinguished by the annual reward of 3,000 pieces. 1,000 was the stipend of the veterans who had fought in the first battles against the Greeks and Persians, and the decreasing pay, as low as 50 pieces of silver, was adapted to the respective merit and seniority of the soldiers of Omar. Under his reign, and that of his predecessor, the conquerors of the East were the trusty servants of God and the people. The mass of the public treasure was consecrated to the expenses of peace and war. A prudent mixture of justice and bounty maintained the discipline of the Saracens, and they united, by a rare felicity, the dispatch and execution of despotism with the equal and frugal maxims of a republican government. The heroic courage of Ali, the consummate prudence of Moawiyah, excited the emulation of their subjects, and the talents which had been exercised in the school of civil discord were more usefully applied to propagate the faith and dominion of the Prophet. In the sloth and vanity of the palace of Damascus, the succeeding princes of the house of Ommeyah were alike destitute of the qualifications of statesmen and of saints. Yet the spoils of unknown nations were continually laid at the foot of their throne, and the uniform ascent of the Arabian greatness must be ascribed to the spirit of the nation rather than the abilities of their chiefs. A large deduction must be allowed for the weakness of their enemies. The birth of Mahomet was fortunately placed in the most degenerate and disorderly period of the Persians, the Romans, and the barbarians of Europe. The empires of Trajan, or even of Constantine or Charlemagne, would have repelled the assault of the naked Saracens, and the torrent of fanaticism might have been obscurely lost in the sands of Arabia. In the victorious days of the Roman Republic, it had been the aim of the Senate to confine their councils and legions to a single war, and completely to suppress a first enemy before they provoked the hostilities of a second. These timid maxims of policy were disdained by the magnanimity or enthusiasm of the Arabian caliphs. With the same vigour and success, they invaded the successors of Augustus and those of Artaxerxes, and the rival monarchies at the same instant became the prey of an enemy whom they had been so long accustomed to despise. In the 10 years of the administration of Omar, the Saracens reduced to his obedience 36,000 cities or castles, destroyed 4,000 churches or temples of the unbelievers, and edified 1,400 mosques for the exercise of the religion of Mahomet. 100 years after his flight from Mecca, the arms and the reign of his successors extended from India to the Atlantic Ocean, over the various and distant provinces, which may be comprised under the names of 1. Persia, 2. Syria, 3. Egypt, 4. Africa, and 5. Spain. Under this general division, I shall proceed to unfold these memorable transactions, dispatching with brevity the remote and less interesting conquests of the East, and reserving a fuller narrative for those domestic countries which had been included within the pale of the Roman Empire. Yet I must excuse my own defects by a just complaint of the blindness and insufficiency of my guides. The Greeks, so loquacious in controversy, have not been anxious to celebrate the triumphs of their enemies. After a century of ignorance, the first annals of the Mussulmans were collected in a great measure from the voice of tradition. Among the numerous productions of Arabic and Persian literature, our interpreters have selected the imperfect sketches of a more recent age. The art and genius of history have ever been unknown to the Asiatics. They are ignorant of the laws of criticism, and our monkish chronicle of the same period may be compared to their most popular works, which are never vivified by the spirit of philosophy and freedom. The Oriental library of a Frenchman would instruct the most learned mufti of the East, and perhaps the Arabs might not find in a single historian so clear and comprehensive a narrative of their own exploits as that which will be deduced in the ensuing sheets. In the first year of the first Caliph, his lieutenant Khalid, the sword of God and the scourge of the infidels, advanced to the banks of the Euphrates, and reduced the cities of Anbar and Hira. Westward of the ruins of Babylon, a tribe of sedentary Arabs had fixed themselves on the verge of the desert, and Hira was the seat of a race of kings who had embraced the Christian religion and reigned above 600 years under the shadow of the throne of Persia. The last of the Mondars was defeated and slain by Khalid. His son was sent a captive to Medina. His nobles bowed before the successor of the Prophet. The people were tempted by the example and success of their countrymen, and the Caliph accepted, as the first fruits of foreign conquest, an annual tribute of 70,000 pieces of gold. The conquerors, and even their historians, were astonished by the dawn of their future greatness. In the same year, says El-Masin, Khalid fought many signal battles. An immense multitude of the infidels was slaughtered, and spoils infinite and innumerable were acquired by the victorious Moslems. But the invincible Khalid was soon transferred to the Syrian war. The invasion of the Persian frontier was conducted by less active or less prudent commanders. The Saracens were repulsed with loss in the passage of the Euphrates, and, though they chastised the insolent pursuit of the Magians, their remaining forces still hovered in the desert of Babylon. The indignation and fears of the Persians suspended for a moment their intestine divisions. By the unanimous sentence of the priests and nobles, their queen Azima was deposed, the sixth of the transient usurpers who had arisen and vanished in 3 or 4 years since the death of Chosroes and the retreat of Heraclius. Her tiara was placed on the head of Yezdegerd, the grandson of Chosroes, and the same era, which coincides with an astronomical period, has recorded the fall of the Sasanian dynasty and the religion of Zoroaster. The youth and inexperience of the prince, he was only 15 years of age, declined a perilous encounter. The royal standard was delivered into the hands of his general Rustam, and a remnant of 30,000 irregular troops was swelled in truth or in opinion to 120,000 subjects or allies of the great king. The Moslems, whose numbers were reinforced from 12 to 30,000, had pitched their camp in the plains of Qadisiyah, and their line, although it consisted of fewer men, could produce more soldiers than the unwieldy host of the infidels. I shall here observe what I must often repeat, that the charge of the Arabs was not, like that of the Greeks and Romans, the effort of a firm and compact infantry. Their military force was chiefly formed of cavalry and archers, and the engagement, which was often interrupted and often renewed by single combats and flying skirmishes, might be protracted without any decisive event to the continuance of several days. The periods of the Battle of Qadisiyah were distinguished by their peculiar appellations. The first, from the well-timed appearance of 6,000 of the Syrian brethren, was denominated the Day of Succor. The Day of Concussion might express the disorder of one, or perhaps of both, of the contending armies. The third, a nocturnal tumult, received the whimsical name of the Night of Barking, from the discordant clamours, which were compared to the inarticulate sounds of the fiercest animals. The morning of the succeeding day determined the fate of Persia, and a seasonable whirlwind drove a cloud of dust against the faces of the unbelievers. The clangour of arms was re-echoed to the tent of Rustam, who, far unlike the ancient hero of his name, was gently reclining in a cool and tranquil shade, amidst the baggage of his camp and the train of mules that were laden with gold and silver. On the sound of danger he started from his couch, but his flight was overtaken by a valiant Arab, who caught him by the foot, struck off his head, hoisted it on a lance, and instantly returning to the field of battle, carried slaughter and dismay among the thickest ranks of the Persians. The Saracens confess a loss of 7,500 men, and the Battle of Qadisiyah is justly described by the epithets of obstinate and atrocious. The standard of the monarchy was overthrown and captured in the field, a leathern apron of a blacksmith, who in ancient times had arisen the deliverer of Persia, but this badge of heroic poverty was disguised, and almost concealed, by a profusion of precious gems. After this victory, the wealthy province of Iraq, or Assyria, submitted to the Caliph, and his conquests were firmly established by the speedy foundation of Bassora, a place which ever commands the trade and navigation of the Persians. As the distance of 80 miles from the Gulf, the Euphrates and Tigris unite in a broad and direct current, which is aptly styled the River of the Arabs. In the midway, between the junction and the mouth of these famous streams, the new settlement was planted on the western bank. The first colony was composed of 800 Moslems, but the influence of the situation soon reared a flourishing and populous capital. The air, although excessively hot, is pure and healthy. The meadows are filled with palm trees and cattle, and one of the adjacent valleys has been celebrated among the 4 paradises or gardens of Asia. Under the first caliphs, the jurisdiction of this Arabian colony extended over the southern provinces of Persia. The city has been sanctified by the tombs of the companions and martyrs, and the vessels of Europe still frequent the port of Bassora as a convenient station and passage of the Indian trade. End of chapter 51, part 1.